Steve's an old friend, and we mentioned already he's a member of Columbia Center Rotary and a laboratory fellow at Pacific Northwest National Lab, where he is a computational biologist. In this role, he's using the laboratory's advanced analytical technologies to develop improved diagnostics and treatments for cancer. Before coming to Eastern Washington in 2000, he was a professor in the Department of Pathology at the University of Utah Medical School. Steve, we're glad to have you, and we are recording his talk to add to the district speakers bureau that we're putting together. So we will hold all our questions until the end of his presentation. It's all yours, Steve.
All right, thank you very much. This is one that I've given a couple of times. Let me share this to you. I actually prepared this in around the early June, June 2nd. And what was surprising is I sort of anticipated I'd have to change this as time went on, but things haven't changed very much. So this just sort of, I prepared this talk to give an overview of what's going on with the disease COVID-19. One of the things I do at Columbia Center Rotary Club is I give talks on science topics that people are interested in. So they said, Steve, tell us about COVID, what you know, and what do we have to look forward to. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that what is a virus? COVID is part of a disease like a virus, which is similar to like polio, smallpox, and other types of viruses. Viruses are non-living particles of genetic materials that basically take over a cell and force them to make more virus. So by themselves, they're not alive. They basically can't replicate by themselves. They have to be transmitted from one organism to another to survive. There are a lot of different types of viruses, and not all of them cause disease. There are literally millions of different types of viruses, and only a handful of them actually cause diseases. Now, most people, especially people who are involved with Rotary, or understand or know a number of different viruses. For example, there's HIV, there's hepatitis B, there's rabies, there's influenza, which of course causes the flu every year. Papillomavirus, which causes warts, and herpes virus. And all these, I think adenovirus causes the common cold. So the outbreak, the pandemic we're facing right now, is caused by a relatively new type of virus, or at least relatively new, that have been infecting humans, and that's called 2019 nCoV, aka SARS-CoV-2. And it's called coronavirus. It's called a coronavirus primarily because of these spike-like structures on the outside of it that makes it look sort of like a solar corona, and that's where the name comes from. It's an RNA virus, so basically it has RNA as a genetic material. It's got a lipid outer layer, and one thing that's really important about that lipid outer layer, that means this is a relatively fragile virus. It doesn't survive very well on the surface. Some viruses, when they go onto flat surfaces or dry surfaces, can survive a long time. COVID actually can't because of this sort of the structure. One of the things, so if it's just one of a lot of different viruses, what's so special about this coronavirus? And that is, and frankly, most viruses are highly specialized for one species. So for example, the polio virus only exists in humans. And one of the things that's nice about it only existing in humans is that once you kill it in humans, it's gone forever. But coronaviruses are called zoonotic viruses that can be transmitted between different species. In other words, they have a reservoir, and the same thing is influenza. And before I go on further, can everyone sort of mute their microphone, because I'm hearing sort of people eating lunch in the background. Thank you. You're making me hungry. They're called zoonotic virus that can be transmitted between different species. that means that if you get rid of them in humans, as long as there's an animal reservoir, it can basically come back and reinfect us. The other thing that happens with zoonotic viruses, like for example influenza, is that when it jumps between species, it puts evolutionary selective pressure on them and they evolve. So they always change. They're always changing, they're dynamic, and they don't go away. Now, in the case of the SARS virus, it originated in bats. Okay, and then it wasn't, these viruses typically do not directly transmit to humans, although it's possible. They typically transmit to some other animal, and then after they change in the other animal, they become infectious to humans. And so, for example, you probably hear about pigs are a fairly good species to transmit viruses. And in recent years, there have been a number of different SARS or COVID or coronaviruses that have been transmitted from bats. And almost all of these are very dangerous. Now, COVID-19, you've probably heard some sort of rumors and stories that perhaps it was a biodefense weapon that escaped. Maybe it came from a laboratory in China. Well, there's really no evidence for that. The closest sequence to the viruses came from bat colonies, and these bat colonies are hundreds of miles away from the outbreak. Genetic evidence indicates that it passed to another animal first and probably arose 3 to 4 years before the outbreak. So the coronavirus was probably going around in rural China for a number of years before it actually made the pandemic. And there's no evidence that was engineered or came from Wuhan laboratory. All the genetic evidence is that it's a relatively simple change from the virus. Now, the evidence so far is that it transmitted from an animal called a pangolin, which is used in China as an exotic food source. It's a 96% match. And then from being transmitted from this animal, it then was able to infect humans. Now, one of the things that's very, very important about the coronavirus is that it comes from bats. These viruses have existed in bat populations for millions and millions of years. And because of that, they've evolved to transmit between the bats. Now, as you probably know, bats do not have hands, so they can't touch each other. And they use echolocation for their prey. So bats are really good at making loud vocalizations. So this virus has evolved in dark caves with animals screaming and shouting at each other. And the reason this is important is because you've probably heard lately that they're seeing the new outbreaks of coronavirus in bars. Well, if you can think of any place in America that's as close to a bat cave as a bar, you'd have to show it to me, because this is really one of the reasons why you have to be careful, because this virus has evolved to transmit under those conditions. And now I'll come back to that later. Now, why is this thing so dangerous? If coronaviruses have been around for a while, why is this causing a pandemic whereas the other ones did not? First of all, it is highly transmissible. This is, of all the coronaviruses that people have seen, this is the most transmissive. They've also, humans, of course, have not seen almost any coronaviruses, and so therefore we don't have a natural immunity. It also attacks an important receptor system that's involved in blood pressure regulation, and it attacks the lungs. And so it's attacking your receptor that regulates your blood pressure, and it's attacking your lungs, and which is obviously very serious for people with heart issues. So it's really a trifecta of why this is so dangerous. Now, it exploits something called the ACE2 receptor system that's present in all sorts of tissues, hearts, eyes, liver, lung. And when it basically binds to this receptor, it disrupts the regulation of blood pressure, gets inside of cells. And because the receptors are so widely distributed in tissues, the chances of it finding entry into cells is very high. Another thing is that it has got great transmissive rates. So typically, when you talk about how transmissible a flu, any kind of viral disease are, there's something called an RO numbers, and that is the probable number of people that you will infect. So the flu has an RO number of about 1.3. COVID is 2 to 2.5. You've probably heard this. It's actually probably newer versions of the virus, so it's probably more transmissive than this. The other thing is that the incubation time is actually long. Flus, but you get the flu, within a couple days you have the flu. You know you're sick. And when you're sick, you stay at home, typically, and you don't transmit it. COVID has a long incubation time from 1 to 14 days, and that means up to 2 weeks after you get this disease, before you have symptoms, you can go out and transmit it. And this has been the huge problem because it looks like the vast majority of the transmission of COVID is from people who have absolutely no symptoms of the disease. To make it worse, the hospitalization rate of the flu is about 2%. The hospitalization of COVID, at least when this slide was made, is about 19%. And the fatalities are far greater in this than they are in the regular flu. Now, this was the hospitalization, the fatality rates in the early part of the pandemic when the primary people who were being infected were older people. And now that younger people are being infected, there's a lot more cases, but the hospitalization rate is somewhat lower and the fatality rate is lower. And so people say, why is COVID not as dangerous as it was? Well, because primarily the people who are getting it now are young people. Now, if you look at the fatality, this was the fatality from January, February, the data in China, which can't be exactly compared to the stuff that we have, because this was in China, in industrial areas in which there's a lot of air pollution and older people who may have compromised lungs. But you can see very easily that the older you are, the greater the incident of death is. And it's not clear why this is the case. If you look at some of the other types of pandemic diseases, you do not see this. And it's suspected that this has to do with both the immune system of older people, their innate immunity, their condition of their hearts and their lungs. Obviously, lung capacity goes down when you get older. But nevertheless, for people in what I would say the Rotary Club age groups, except for obviously someone's in this down to 40, most of us have really an issue, which of course is another reason for people like me who are in these older age groups to be concerned. Now, the primary way that the scientists have been trying to figure out what's going on in this disease is to make basically mathematical models. And you've heard about these models, and these models sort of change all the time. Well, the models don't actually change. What happens is the parameters. This is basically a standard compartment model of diseases in which you have a group of people who are susceptible. Then at some rate, the susceptible people are exposed to the disease. And there's a certain rate at which the people become infected. You can actually be exposed, and if you're exposed to a low level of virus, you can actually have a little bit of immunity. So there's a rate in which you become immune without being infected. Once you're infected, you become infectious. And this is the rate at which you're generating a virus load sufficiently high where you can transmit it to someone else. And this takes time. And then, of course, when you're infectious, you can now transmit it to the exposed. Then you can either basically, and this is by various ways, if you're infectious, you can either recover, and then if you recover, you're almost always immune, or you can die, in which case you don't have to worry about immunity, and you don't have to worry about transmitting it. And of course, then when you're immune, you have to worry about the mutations. Now, what happened is that we had this model when the disease started, but what we didn't know is what these rates were. And so we just had to wait. I mean, scientists had to wait, and we'll look at different populations, different groups to understand what was going on to be able to build the model. And you could see this easily in the early time in which this was like the models were changing from April 2nd to April 5th to April 7th. And these were the uncertainties. And so basically this was the projected peak of death. This was all based on the best knowledge that they had. And you can see even back then, the uncertainty they had on the outcome was significant. What they really worried about when they started modeling this is that if we didn't do anything, this would be the cases being reported. And that is, you would basically, if there was no steps to take to change this, so in other words, you just let this nature takes its course and you don't try to change the rate of exposure or the rate of infection, they were predicting there'd be a big peak and then it'd go away. This peak would have been millions of deaths in the United States. And that did not look like a good idea. And so what they were trying to do is to flatten the curve. However, if you flatten the curve too fast, and then you now basically you lift the intervention, so now you do it again, you get a second peak. In actuality, we're not in the second peak right now. We're in this sort of a first peak that has a hump in it, because the transmission rates have really never gone down because we simply have never been able to control the transmission. So one of the things that people ask me all the time, Steve, when will it all end? How do you stop this? Frankly, there's only 2 points at which this will end. Either until everyone is infected or until a vaccine is developed. Those are our 2 options. And that is very unlikely that COVID-19 to disappear on its own. It's simply too infectious. It survives too long. If you look at the models going away, it's not going away on its own. And so what most of the measures have been taken is to delay the infections until effective treatments are developed. Obviously, if everyone gets infected, it doesn't end, but they have a treatment so you don't die. That's good. Although, frankly, they don't know what all the long-term consequences. There's evidence that this disease attacks the nervous systems. Some people have lost their sense of taste, their sense of smell, and they haven't come back. So there's a lot of unknown about this. So even if they have treatment so you don't die, I don't really think you want to see what happens. But developing an effective vaccine is the end game. If we can delay the infections to a point where we can develop a vaccine, then that will make it, then we will have a good outcome. Obviously, the best way to delay infections is to reduce the transmission. And since the pre-infective phase is so long, most transmission is likely to come from people who don't know they have the disease. What we know is that transmission is mostly through the aerosols, and this is based upon the normal situation. That's how bats do it. They transmit it by basically screaming. And the best way to reduce the transmission is by social distancing and face masks. And this is not just, this does not make a trivial difference. This actually can make a huge difference. For example, if you look at a normal behavior, what they know about COVID, one person can normally infect in 5 days 2.5 people. And in 30 days, that one person will have infected 400 people. If you just reduce the contact by 50%, this goes to half as many people, but in 30 days, because you've broken the logarithmic growth cycle, you only get 15 people. And if you have 75% less contact, one person will infect this, and you only have 2.5 people. As we've gotten more information, people have been able to estimate, based upon the known transmission rates and the rates at which people wear masks, it's estimated that if 80% of the people, when they were out and about, wore masks, within a couple of months, this disease would probably be gone, simply because the transmission rate would be so low that it would no longer be able to sustain it. And so that's why when this became obvious, this is why the idea about social distancing and wearing face masks became so important. And the reason we want to wear face masks is because when people cough, they generate these droplets contained in the air. And these droplets, if they get into your mouth or they get into surfaces and within an hour you touch it, this has to be done relatively quickly. But the idea is that these particles, this is the way it's transmitted. So the way to keep from transmitting these particles is to put a cloth mask in front of your face. You wear a cloth mask not to prevent yourself from getting infected, but prevent yourself from infecting other people. So people who go out without a face mask and say, I'm not afraid of being infected, completely miss the point. It's not about them, it's about other people. Face mask does not protect you very much. It protects other people from you. And you may have the disease for weeks and not even know about it. So if we reduce the transmission rate and wait for a vaccine to develop, what is the probability of developing a vaccine? Turns out there's actually pretty good news on developing a vaccine, because COVID-19 doesn't seem to have developed the capacity for rapid mutations, unlike flu virus. The influenza virus has a fairly robust genetic rearrangement system, so it mutates quickly. So that's why you have to have a new flu virus every year. Even though the old flu viruses will protect you somewhat, the influenza mutates so much so that you need a new virus, you need a new vaccine every year, but does not seem to be the case with COVID. The other thing is that people have been working on new approaches for vaccine development over the last decade, but haven't had the chance to try it out. It turns out that vaccine development is not very financially remunerative, because most people, by the time you develop a vaccine, the disease is gone. And so pharmaceutical companies, if they spend 2 years to develop a vaccine against a particular disease that is not really dangerous and it's not really endemic, the chances are they'll never make their money back. But scientists don't care about making money, so basically scientists have been working for years to develop fast and quick ways of doing vaccine that no one has really cared about very much. But guess what? People care about it now. And so these new vaccine approaches, which have been around for a while, promise to be very safe and effective. And 3 different ways of doing it. For example, you've known about DNA sequencing. We can sequence these viruses, and we can take the genetic material out of this virus, the genetic material that encodes the spike protein, for example, take this genetic material and put it into a harmless virus. And this is called a recombinant vector vaccine, then immunize people with this harmless virus that expresses these coat proteins, and voila, you've got an antibody, you develop an immune system against COVID. You can also genetically express the proteins, or even simpler, you just take the genetic material itself, synthesize it, make a nucleic acid, and inject it. And in fact, this nucleic acid vaccine, this is one of the ones that have been tested that is undergo rapid development, and this is also undergoing rapid development. The great thing about these kind of vaccine approaches is that the chances of side reactions are extremely low. And the second thing is it's very easy to scale these up for massive production. Old vaccines took a lot of times to gear up the manufacturing. These new vaccines are much faster to be able to get up into production. So last is, one of the people say, well, I have antibodies in my blood, therefore I didn't notice that I was infected. And so people were thinking that some of the people who get the COVID don't come down with the disease. And that's not necessarily the case. To actually get sick, you need enough of a dose of virus to overcome your innate immunity. In other words, if you get a little bit of a virus dose, it may not be enough for you to get COVID, but it may be enough to generate antibodies in your blood. So some of the people who have antibodies in their blood, it's not clear that those antibodies were actually from an infection. And the other thing is, it's not clear that those antibodies are strong enough to prevent an infection. Sorry. So this is why, even if you have antibodies in your blood, it doesn't mean you can't be infected. That's why it's essential to keep our exposure to infected individuals as low as possible until a vaccine is developed. And people keep asking me, well, how fast will that be? I would be really surprised if by the end of this year, there isn't an antibody, a vaccine that's developed and available. So best guess is that we only have to wait another 8 or 9 months before this starts going away completely. Questions?
Wow, that's encouraging.
Yeah, and that's my presentation.
Very good.
Questions?
I have a question.
Certainly.
Sometimes we have heard that you're not likely to be infected unless you're by someone for a time period like 10 minutes.
Depends.
What's the story? It's just a matter of probability of the droplets or something?
Pure probability. What they're finding, especially in the last 6 weeks, if you're outside and there's a wind, chance of getting extremely low. So if you're outside on a trail and you're not within someone and someone can spray on you and stuff like that, your chance of getting it is extremely low. If you're inside in a bar, your chances are probably 100%. Seriously. There are certain places, do not go in. It's a probability. It's the dose, it's the volume that you speak, it's how close you get to people, it's the air circulation supplies. It turns out, for example, that that in Europe, people have been able to open up the restaurants in Europe without seeing a resurgence. For some reason, European restaurants have much better air circulation than American restaurants do, either because of their size, their high ceilings, and their their air circulation. If there's a lot of airflow, the chances are very low. So it's a matter of probabilities, that's all.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can the virus get transmitted through your eye surfaces?
Yes. That's one of the reasons why the
So a
face mask.
shield,
That's why they wear shields, right?
is a shield better than a mask?
Well, it depends. The shield is to protect you. The mask is to protect other people. So that's why, for example, you'll see in stores, like at the checkout counters of grocery stores, you'll see the checkers will have a mask. They'll also have a shield. That's
Right.
to keep them from being infected by other people.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
This is a question.
Go ahead.
Or are you surprised that our president hasn't got sick, or is he just giving it to other people or without a mask? Do you have any feeling on that?
It's a probability. It's like, I haven't gotten sick either. A lot of people haven't gotten sick. You'll notice today they announced that the president of Brazil, who's been poo-pooing this for the last couple of months, he has it now. Surprise! I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 months that that Trump gets it, or not. It's just a matter of probability.
Is there a typical infection time or mean time out of that 2 weeks?
About 2 weeks.
What's the average?
Depends on the age, depends on the exposure. People who get a big dose will get it quicker than the people who get a low dose. That's why, for example, people in cars have gotten it really quickly. You see it within a week.
It's a dosage question.
It's a dosage problem. It's pure probability dosage. It's sort of like radiation. People have shown that it's like a radiation. You get a big dose of radiation, you die real quickly. Yes.
Steve, I'm curious, if someone is tested for the antibodies because they think they may have had
the exposure, and had the illness 6 months ago before COVID was really well known, can they infect people who have not had it, or no, because they're now over the disease?
If they had it, if the antibodies actually reflect them have it, and you can generally do it if you do a titer. Most of these antibody tests don't tell you how much antibodies you have. If you do an accurate one, you can tell the dose, which is why some of the antibody tests are. If you've had it and you have high titer of antibody, it's extremely unlikely for you ever to transmit it to someone else. Okay, and you're safe from it. No one has reported a case yet of someone who has been infected with it and been sick with it and got it a second time. You may have heard, for example, some sailors on the ship had antibodies and then they got it subsequently. But the sailors that got the antibodies there was no evidence that they actually had it the first time around. They were probably picked up the antibodies from the secondary exposure. But they also found that naval ship that everyone who did social distancing and wore a face mask, their probability of getting the disease was much, much less than their other shipmates who didn't do that. So that was a natural experiment.
I got a question for you too. The idea of the droplets, I get that. What about contact on surfaces?
2 hours.
2 hours?
The best estimate is about 2 hours. So if someone sneezes, you rub the surface and you rub your face, yeah, you'll probably get it.
That's why they're saying don't touch your face, wash off. And how is soap and water so effective against something like that?
It's really effective. It's really effective. That's because what happens is that these coronaviruses have, as I said, an outside envelope. This is lipid. It's soap. And so basically they're encased in a soap bubble, and you put soap in there, it disrupts them completely. So it's just as good as bleach. You don't have to use bleach. Just use soap and water. That's fine.
Phil Lemley has a question, but he's on mute. So
Phil, unmute yourself.
That's the problem. Okay. Initial precursor was a fever. And now this morning or here recently, they said that at least in older people, and most of the others, that the fever is not necessarily a precursor of the disease anymore.
Probably true. They learn it's a brand new disease. We're learning all these weird things about it. Yes.
If you shake someone's hand that's positive and you go and wash your,
it's fine.
Are you okay?
Probably.
Okay.
I would not shake my hands with someone who had COVID, though.
Right. But I mean, if you came in contact with it by hand and you simply didn't touch yourself, and you washed your hand, everything was okay. Right.
And the thing is, it really is a intensity. For example, you probably heard the story up in north of Seattle, the choir group. The choir group came up and did a rehearsal. There was someone there who was in the choir who basically had it, and I think that about 70% of everyone in the choir room got it, and 2 people died. And the reason is because when you sing, you project, and then you're in a room. But not 100% got it. So it's sort of this, but 60%, that's pretty high for being in a choir room and no one touching each other. So it's simply a matter of degree, dose, time, exposure. Minimize all those things and don't worry about it. I don't worry about it. I just stay away from other people. That's all.
Steve, I have a question.
Yes.
Why are communities of color so prone to get more of the virus than others? Is it primarily just societal living conditions?
Not clear. Not clear. For example, they know, for example, that in Italy, a lot of Italians got it a lot more than Americans because they live in bigger families and smaller homes and more contact. People of colors who's had it, they tend to basically be the people who were in, for example, in New York, crowded living conditions. They have much more crowded living conditions with those people than the population as a whole. Their health tends to be less because obviously their social economic status isn't higher. And now it looks like there might be a genetic component. Putting all this stuff together and you have an elevated rate.
Well, I was thinking primarily of the Hispanic community.
Yes. Big families living together in crowded areas. That's
Multi-generational.
Yep, and that's considered to be the primary reason why that they are much more susceptible.
Is that the primary reason for the high rates in our area?
Hard to tell. I know that a significant percentage of our higher rates is due to the Hispanic and the agricultural industry, because of the nature of those areas. For example, at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, we've had, I think, 2 cases, and they were not transmitted, and that's because we work at home. And when we didn't work at home, we worked at offices separated from other people or laboratories. And so we wouldn't be expected to do it. In a meat packing house, people are working shoulder to shoulder processing stuff. You're going to get it. But the other reason is the fact that we have a much higher rate is because the rate of social distancing and mask wearing in this area is significantly less than it is in other parts of the state. And you can ask me why, but you don't have to, you know why. So it's one of these things like when you protest wearing a face mask, it's not about you, it's about other people. And for some reason, people think they have a right to go out and give people a disease. And frankly, I don't understand that, but you know, I'm just a scientist. I don't know stuff like this.
Steve, would you speak to the efficiency of the masks that are available to us?
Just as long as you can't, 3 layers is probably good enough. I mean, the thing is that it doesn't have to be 100%. As I said, as long as you get the transmission down to a certain point, the dose and the rate, the probability of transmitting is much lower. So it's basically, if you compare a mask, a single layer of cloth with no mask, it's vastly superior. 3 layers are better, and N95 mask is best of all. You're just trying to get the rates down to a certain point. So anything helps.
Okay, I need to interrupt right now because we're at the end of our time limit. But I would ask Steve if he'd be willing to stay on and take more questions if anybody's interested.
Yeah.
But at this time, I want to thank Steve. That was a great presentation. Very interesting. Glad you could make it.
Thank you.
Renee, thank you for coming today. For all the Rotarians, appreciate you coming online. I wanted to send out a special thanks to Jackson for starting up the reactor again. That I think that's a real valuable piece of communication for our club, and we're going to keep continuing that. And at this time, we end our official meeting. But if anybody wants to stay on and ask some more questions, we'll leave the meeting open and be able to do that.
Everyone stay safe, wear your mask.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I just want to say thank you, Steve, for this presentation. That's amazing. I work for KEDLEC, as you know, and on behalf of the hospitals locally, this is really important information to get out there because I just got the numbers from Benton County and Franklin County. We had 56 cases in Benton County today and 75 in Franklin County today.
Oh my.
A few weeks, we've seen more cases than we've seen during the height of it. And we are caring for more patients in the hospital today, twice as many as we saw in April. And our staff are really, I've shared this with the Rotarians, our staff are really going through some post-traumatic stress right now. They have not had a break since the middle of February taking care of these patients. And so we ask people to really keep their distance is the biggest thing and wear your mask. If you're wearing a mask and staying 6 feet away from folks, we have nothing to worry about.
Right.
I've been able to stay safe that way. It's
Right.
really the bottom line. It's when you, to your point, if you take the mask off and say, I'm not going to do it for me because I don't have to, because I'm an American and you can't tell me what to do, then you're putting everybody's health at risk, and that's going to ruin our economy. If we are not healthy, our economy can't get healthy.
Right.
But thank you. Appreciate
Thank you.
you.
Appreciate it. You know, that's one of the things that people sometimes fail to understand is that they had not started this social distances and staying at home during the early part of this pandemic, the impact would have been unimaginably bad. This is a bad disease. This is a very, very bad disease. And people who say, oh, it's a hoax, it's not real, and stuff like that. It's like, I mean, come on. I mean, it is. This is a science issue. This is not a political issue. And people understood from the beginning that this was a bad disease. But until time went by and they could actually count the number of people and the infections and the different people and stuff like that, they didn't know how bad it was going to be. And guess what? It was pretty much as bad as the worst case scenario was. But what's happening is that people are getting tired of being indoors. I mean, I don't blame them. I'm sick of it. But the thing is, I don't want to die either, and I don't want to kill someone else. And so therefore, I'll suck it up and deal with it. And I think that one of the nice things that PNNL has done a really good job is because they have almost 7,000 employees, and literally they've had 2 people who've gotten sick, and they haven't gotten sick at work, because guess what? Scientists tend to be rational about these things, and and so they've read it and say, okay, we'll do it. And this could have been over by now. That's what's frustrating about it. This could have been over. But it's not, because of politics. And it's just, it makes me so frustrated why politics has to rear its ugly head at the worst possible time, especially for old people like us.
Steve, as one of those people who is supposed to stay home all the time, since I'm well up in my 80s and I have an underlying condition, your information, while appreciated very much, is certainly not very encouraging. I guess the only answer for me is simply stay home as much as I can, I guess. Forever.
Yeah, it'll be over. I tell everyone that I said I would put money down a year from now, this will all be gone. It'll all be gone. Okay, because what will happen is the fact that they'll get a vaccine. The vaccine will work. I mean, people. One of the things the scientists say, scientists have not. You haven't heard them saying, "Oh yeah, vaccine will be a slam dunk." And one of the reasons is because in science you want to underpromise and overdeliver. Okay, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, because this is a situation in which the only solution is a science solution, and it takes time, and they're going really fast. I'm impressed at how fast the progress is, but it'll still take a time. Once they have the vaccine, they'll probably have something that they'll publicize working about 3 months. It'll take a couple of months to manufacture it. Then they've got to set out the logistics of how they treat people. And so there'll be a lot of months worth. But the good news is that once they start rolling it out in the area, probably the people that will get it first are people like us, people who are at home, people who have underlying health issues. You treat those people first to protect us, and then you work down your way down the food chain. So all this stuff is being discussed. This is only a 2020 problem. 2021 will be a brave new world, and we will be in Rotary clubs together and eating lunch together. And oh, I'm pretty sure. I mean, this is not a long-term issue. And the good news is that the lessons we've learned about this will really help us to head off another pandemic in the future. This has been predicted for years and years and years by scientists and modelers. It was just a matter of time. But you never could get the government to really invest significantly in these kind of things until it had this kind of impact. So we know how to deal with this. It's just we've never had the will to take care of this until now.